What's up everybody, it's your boy Nos and welcome back to the channel. So in this video, I'm going to be going over the basics you need to run a successful Gren Maju deck, or a banishment deck rather. Now there are many cards you can add to this deck, so anything additionally to the basics you want to run would be on you, whether it's a monster, a trap, magic card, or any extra, or how many cards you want to run in this deck entirely would be completely up to you. So let's start out with the monsters, everybody. The first monster you would have to run without a doubt in this deck to make it work would be no other than Gren Maju. Now, Gren Maju practically is the star of this deck, so I personally would run 3 of these, and the card reads as such. This card's attack and slash defense are each equal to the number of banished cards times 400. So the more cards that get banished from the game, the better, and that works for both your deck and your opponent's deck. So if you manage to banish some of your opponent's deck, then this card just gets stronger based on that as well. Highly recommend running 3 of these, but if you run anything less than 3, probably not the best idea, but it's up to you guys. Another card you have to run this deck would be another card just like Gren Maju, but it's called Eater of Millions. Now Eater works almost the same way as Gren Maju, but instead of gaining 400, he gains 100, but he has additional effects on top of that. The card reads as such: cannot be normal summoned as set, but must be special summoned by your hand by banishing 5 or more cards from your hand, field, or extra deck. So what that means is you can choose what cards you want to banish, and personally when I use this card, I like to banish my extra deck because it doesn't take any cards away that I would be using personally for the duel. Because the extra deck I mainly make is just a throwaway, but if there's anything you want to add to the extra deck you think would work with this deck, by all means add it, but just consider you might be throwing it away in the future. This card also will gain 100 attack and defense for each face down banished card, cannot be tributed nor used as material or fusion monsters, synchro, or XYZ summon, which you probably won't anyway if you're running this card. Once per turn at the start of the damage step, if this card battles an opponent's monster, you can banish that opponent's monster face down. So what that means is if you engage an opponent's monster, even if it's stronger than you, say it has like 3,000 attack points or something that's towering over you the whole duel, you can use the effect of this monster to banish it and get it off the field, unless it has like one of those effects that like negates an effect. That's the only thing that probably could stop it, or a trap card or a magic card. But definitely would recommend running 3 of these because it's an easy way to also get rid of your opponent's monsters on the field, and also turns the table for your Gren Maju when you finally able to summon them, because the more cards you banish with this thing, the stronger Gren Maju gets as well. Highly recommend running 3 of these. Another card I highly recommend running for this deck would be Necroface. Necroface, it works similar to the banishment, but instead it replenishes your deck, and I'll read what it states. If this card is normal summon, shuffle all banished cards into the deck. This card gains 100 attack for each card shuffled into the main deck. By this effect, if this card is banished, each player banishes 5 cards from the top of the deck, or the entire deck if less than 5. So how that works is, so if you say you have 20 cards from your main deck that are banished, for each card you are banished, if you play this card face up, you get 100 attack points for it, and those cards get also put back into your main deck. So this is a good way to elongate the duel and to keep the duel going if you want to get some cards maybe you banished that you didn't mean to banish, or just happen to banish because of other card effects based on this deck. Really good card. Definitely recommend running 3 of these because of its secondary effect. Because how that works is if you manage to banish this card, it will banish 5 more cards from your deck and your opponent's deck. And if you successfully ban this card and then another Necroface was in those 5, it will just chain up until you don't get one, and it will just continuously banish 5. So you can banish up to 3 Necrofaces in total for a total of 15 cards in succession in a chain if you're very lucky. Really good card to recommend running 3, and especially if you want to get cards back from your banish zone. Another card I would recommend running in terms of banishment would be Banisher of the Radiance. This card isn't necessarily needed for this deck, but with its effect, I definitely recommend running at least one of them in case you get it early game. And as long as this guy's on the field, any card that would be sent to the graveyard will then be banished instead. Like I said, this is not normal for a Gren Maju deck. Like, it's not really needed for one, but I personally have been using this guy a lot, and he actually works really well. So I'd recommend running at least one of them. If you want to run any more, that's up to you, but it doesn't work a whole lot well with any of the other cards because it is a fairy card and not a fiend card, where most of the cards you run in this deck are fiend cards. But I've been using it, testing it out, and I think this would be a good addition to the deck. This is kind of one of those extra cards I'd recommend you using if you want to run a successful Gren Maju deck, or if maybe if you're just starting off with it and you don't know if you can trust the RNG of any of your other banishments, and you just want to kind of control the field at this point. Definitely recommend at least running one of these. A few honorable additions I would recommend for Gren Maju would be cards like the Danger cards, Hexatrude for the Stromberg, and a few other ones like the Giga Rays Gandora or just regular Gandora, because most of these work in tangent with some sort of banishment. So let's start going over with the Hexatrude and the bird, Gilf the Phantom Bird. Now, how Gilf works is mainly I use this card to help me get another card on the field, which is called Golden Castle Stromberg, that's what its effect does. You can discard this card, add 1 Golden Castle Stromberg from your deck to your hand, and if this card is normal summon or special summon, you can target 1 card in your opponent's spell and trap zone and destroy it. I don't use that effect as much as the other one, but it's still a good effect to have if you're trying to deal with pesky traps or other cards. You can only use the effect of 1 Gilf the Phantom Bird once per turn. I personally run 1 of these. It's a good card to have. If you want to run more, that's up to you, but it really is only for the card of Golden Castle Stromberg, which is a Magic's Field card, and I'll get into that later. Another card I'd recommend from the Stromberg set is Hexatrude, because it works with Castle Stromberg. As long as you have Stromberg on the field, you can summon this from either your hand, in your deck, without tribute summoning. And so it's a good way to get a level 8 monster out really early. But the effects of Golden Castle Stromberg help it even more, because at that point, you can just target any card you want on the field and destroy it as long as there's 1 Golden Castle Stromberg up. Really powerful card to have in the game as long as you have Golden Castle Stromberg. Just be careful though, because if they do end up destroying your Golden Castle Stromberg, this card will not be able to use its effects anymore. Additional effects of this card, even without Stromberg though, that can be really good for the duel is if you do end up destroying a monster, you get 400 attack points. Or if you also if you actually do successfully destroy it, you can also give this card 2 attacks on monsters during each battle phase. Don't use that one as much as destroying the spells I see or any additional cards I want to destroy, but it's a great card to run with Stromberg. I'd recommend running at least 1 of these. I personally run 2 of them because you can, as long as Stromberg is up once per turn, you can actually get 1 of these out of your deck, assuming they're not banished. So I personally run 2. Other additional monsters I'd run would be this card, which would be Gizmic Orochi, and it works kind of like this card, the Pot of Desires. And how the Pot of Desires works is it banishes 10 cards from the top of your deck, face down, draws 2 cards, and you can only activate 1 Pot of Desires per turn. So basically a good way to banish cards and to draw some cards. But this is kind of like a downscaled version of that. It's just a way to banish cards and to get a little high-leveled monster out on the field. Because anytime you use the effect of Gizmic Orochi, whether it's in your graveyard, your hand, or or not in your deck, just only your hand or your graveyard, you can summon this guy without tribute and get him on the field. Additional effects would be you can banish 3 cards from your extra deck face down to target 1 monster on the field and destroy it. So another good way to banish cards, assuming you have those other cards on the field that could banish monsters instead of sending them to the graveyard. Really highly recommend at least running 1 of these, because this card continuously comes back throughout the duel, assuming you use its effect. I personally don't see any use of running more than just 1, but I'd recommend running 1 for a successful Gren Maju deck. Now, those are all the monsters I'd recommend running. There's quite a few magic cards I'd go over to run for this deck, but there's only 3 basic ones I'd say you have to run a successful Gren Maju deck. And the first one I mentioned earlier was Pot of Desires. Banish 10 cards from the top of your deck and face down, draw 2 cards, and you can only activate 1 Pot of Desires per turn. So it's a good way to banish cards and also draw some cards. Definitely recommend running at least 1 or 2 of these. You personally don't need to max them out, but I personally like to run 3 of these because I'm not a huge fan of the other card that you need to run in this deck. So instead of running that, I just run 3 of these. But another card you need to run this deck that I'd recommend if you want to run it, I don't personally think you need it, but a lot of Gren Maju decks run this card, would be Pot of Extravagance. It works very similar to Pot of Desires, but in a different way. It banishes your extra deck and not your main deck. So you can choose to banish up to 3 to 6 of them, and it works the same way. You can only use 1 per turn, and also you draw. Other than that, definitely recommend this card if you want to get rid of your extra deck or you have no other way to get rid of your extra deck. But if you only have Eater of Millions on the field, I personally don't think you need this one at all in your deck. But if you think you need it, run at least 1. But personally, I'd run 3 Pot of Desires rather than Pot of Extravagance. But this is definitely a recommended card. The other card I'd recommend running for this deck would be another draw card called Allure of Darkness, and this works by you choose one monster to banish after you draw cards, assuming you have a dark monster in your hand. But you still can draw 2 cards. But say if you draw your 2 cards and none of them are a dark monster, or you don't have a dark monster in hand, you have to end up throwing your whole hand away. So this card is very, very situational. So I'd be very careful when using this card. Personally, only run like 2 of these in my main deck. But if you do run more than 2, just know the repercussions. The props of this card though works really well with Eater of Millions and Necroface, because assuming you're trying to get more cards for your Eater or even your Gren Maju, really helps you banish the monsters. But it really works really well with Necroface, because you can use Necroface to be banished, and when you banish Necroface, it's an additional 5 on top of the 1 you banished, which was Necroface. So that's 6 cards you can banish just by using this card, assuming you have Necroface in your hand. So definitely recommend running at least 1 of these. I personally run 2. Another card I mentioned earlier was Golden Castle Stromberg, rather, my bad. And this card has a very big description, so I'm just gonna abbreviate it for you guys. So basically, it works similar to how the Pot of Desires works, where it banishes the top 10 cards of your deck, but it does that in every one of your standby phases. So every time you start a new turn, as long as this card is equipped to your field spell, you automatically drop 10 cards. It's a really good card. It really helps for defense as well, because the additional effects of it is if somebody attacks you while this card is up on the field, it destroys that monster, and half the monster's attack points is reverted back to them as damage. So it's a really pesky card to deal with. Definitely recommend it if you run any Gren Maju deck, any variation, any kind. You need at least 1 of these in your deck. I personally run 2, and works really well with the bird to try to get this guy out, and also to have Hexatrude, because Hexatrude works with this card. Just keep in mind though, if you have any less than 10 cards in your deck, this card will automatically be destroyed. So that's why cards like Necroface will come into play to help replenish your deck and to keep this card going longer. So that's why I'd recommend running 2 in case this card ever does get destroyed, so you can put another one out in the field and keep the duel going. Additional magic cards I'd recommend, which aren't necessarily needed for this build, but I definitely would recommend, are this card, Soul Absorption, which works well with the banishments, because you gain 500 life points for every single card that is banished. So 500 times 5, that's 2,500 life points you automatically gain. So the more cards that are banished, the better. So this is just a way to keep the duels going, to keep the duel elongated, and to keep yourself going. Like say if you weren't getting any good draws, or you actually banished your best cards until you get like a Necroface or some way to get those cards back from your banishment zone, this is a good way to keep you going, because as long as you keep on banishing monsters, you keep on gaining life points. Definitely recommend running at least 1 of these. I personally run 2 because they help elongate a duel and they help keep you alive. Next card I'd recommend for this deck is in the middle for a recommendation, but I'd recommend using at least 1 of them, would be Dimensional Fissure. So any monster sent to the graveyard will be banished instead. So if I engaged you in combat, I beat you, yada yada, all that good stuff, instead of going to the graveyard, nah, that card's removed from the game. Definitely recommend running 1 of these, because it can tip the scale, and especially if they keep on utilizing their graveyard, or they're running some kind of deck that revolves around them sending cards to the graveyard. A great counter for those kind of decks. Also, it's a good way for you to put more of your cards into the banishment zone rather than the graveyard, because if they destroyed one of your monsters, it'd work exactly the same way. Recommend running 1 of these, but you can run up to 3 if you like. Another card I'd recommend for this build, which I forgot to go over, would be Golden Sarcophagus. Now, you can only run 1 of these cards in your deck, but I highly recommend running it because it works really well with cards like the Faceless Devourer. How the card works is banish 1 card from your deck face up during your second standby phase. After this card's activation, add that card to your hand. So if I was to use this card on Faceless Devourer, it would banish it, so I would get the additional effect of Faceless as well to get another 5 cards banned. And then 2 turns later, I would just get Faceless back to my hand. So it's a really good card to use if you're anticipating that you might not be able to get a Gren Maju out, or maybe you accidentally banish Gren Maju and you want to make sure that you have a failsafe in act. And this is definitely a card I'd recommend to ensure that failsafe and to ensure the victory with a Gren Maju deck. Another card that I've actually newly added to my deck, which is really good, honestly, but I'm still experimenting with, would be Inferno Tempest. Now, this is kind of like a safe haven kind of card, like, or a fail safe rather, if you were to take a lot of damage. So, like, it works well with the soul absorption in case you have all those life points. But when you take 300 or more battle damage from one attack, you can activate this card and remove all monsters in each player's deck and graveyard from play. So if you're afraid they're going to be summoning a lot of really high powered monsters, or they're running those really annoying kind of decks that just like constantly dips into their graveyard or dips into their deck, and they just keep on summoning monsters over and over again, if they attack you with a really strong attack, banish all of them. Banish everything in a deck, banish everything in the graveyard. Highly recommend at least running one of these. I'm actually tempted to run 3 of these in my deck because you never know when you actually draw one. Highly recommended card, but it's a newer card I've been experimenting with. Now, those are all the magic cards I'd recommend. Now let's go over the trap cards. There's only a few trap cards I'd recommend for this deck, but any other additional trap card would be up to you for this deck. The 3 I'd recommend are as follows. First, you can have Banquet of Millions, and Banquet works similar to Eater of Millions, but it's a trap instead. So banish any number of cards from your extra deck face down, and banish the same number of random face down cards from your opponent's extra deck face up until the end phase. So basically what that means is if I choose to banish 5 cards from my deck, it's also going to banish the 5 cards from their deck as well. Hence, will make my cards stronger and remove their cards from play. But the only thing is, it doesn't keep their cards banished. If I use this card to banish their extra deck, they'll come back in my next standby phase. So it's a card that's good for 1 turn for your opponent's deck, but for you, banishing cards indefinitely, it works really well. I personally run 2 of these, but you can run up to 3. Highly recommend running 2 at least, because with Eater of Millions in conjunction with this card, they work really well together. So definitely recommend running this in any Gren Maju build. Other than that, 2 additional cards I'd recommend would be DD Dynamite, which DD Dynamite works with your banishment as well, because based on how many cards are banished in your opponent's side of the field, this card will do 300 damage. And a build I've been seeing lately with DD Dynamite is running mainly with conjunction of Banquet of Millions, because if you ran Banquet of Millions, you banish all 15 of their cards. You take 15 times 300. Boom, that's almost all their life points. Definitely run at least 1 of these. It's good if you're trying to get some life points out additionally, but anything less than 2 would probably be idiotic in my opinion, because 2, assuming you had 1 Banquet of Millions out and 2 DD Dynamite, that's the game right there. Highly recommend running one of these. It's not necessary for a Gren Maju deck, but it's an additional card I'd highly recommend for Gren Maju if you want to tip the scales of a duel. Another card I'd recommend for traps is similar to Dimensional Fissure, but it's called Marco Cosmos. It's a trap card that's continuous, just like Dimensional Fissure, but how it works is when this card resolves, you can special summon Helios, the Primal Sun, from your hand or deck. You don't use it for that effect, but unless you want to build a Helios kind of style deck with Gren Maju, that'd be up to you. But I don't use the first effect. I mainly use the second effect, which is just the same as Dimensional Fissure. While this card is face up on the field, any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. But it's a better version of Dimensional Fissure because it banishes every card, not just monsters, but every card, traps, magic, anything. So definitely recommend running 1 of these. I personally have been running 2, but it may be a little overkill because my deck is getting up to like 50 cards. But depending on how many cards you want to personally run in your deck, run at least 1. This is a good card to tilt the scales and to remove cards from play. Now, there are a few extra cards I would definitely recommend running for every Gren Maju deck. They're not needed, honestly, because I throw away most of these cards. I never get a chance to use them. But if you do end up ending to use any of these extra cards, these are the 4 I'd recommend running in any Gren Maju deck. Starving Ven Fusion Dragon is another card that works well in this deck because your deck is basically based on mainly dark monsters. So 2 dark monsters on the field, except tokens, you can easily summon this guy. But you also have to run a polymerization or a super poly or something like that. So if you run polymerization or anything like that, this would be definitely a card I'd recommend. I personally run only a super poly every once in a while, but other than that, mainly the cards in my extra deck I just get thrown away. So this card works as such. If this card is fusion summoned, you can take this card and gain attack equal to 1 opponent's special summon monster until the end of this turn. once per turn, you can target one level 5 or higher monster your opponent controls until the end phase. This card's name becomes that monster's original name and replaces this effect with the monster's original effect. If this fusion summon card is destroyed, you can destroy all your opponent's special summon monsters. So it's a good way to utilize field advantages if they have a pesky monster that you just can't get rid of, or no matter what they do, or if they have a card that has like really good effects that keeps on destroying, like Gren Maju and anything like that. This is kind of like a fail-safe fusion card. I personally don't use this as much as I could possibly, but I definitely recommend running this card if you can utilize polymerization, or if you want to run more polymerizations in your deck. Another good fusion monster I'd recommend is similar to this one. It's Predaplant Dragostar. I'm sorry if I butchered that name. I still don't know how to properly say it, but it's a one fusion monster and one dark monster. So basically, it's the more dark monsters in your deck, the better. Once per turn, quick effect, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, place one predator counter on it, and if it is level 2 or higher, it becomes level 1 as long as it has a predator counter. Negate the activate effect on your opponent's monster that have predator counters. A really good card if you're trying to utilize the predator effect on it, but it's also a good way so you just can negate the activated effects on it. If you can also use your the predator effect on your own cards, and that's typically really well with this card, and another fusion card I'm just about to mention. Next fusion monster I recommend is Predaplant Trivilibutrum. I'm sorry if I butchered that one, but I'm trying my best here, people. This card, you can use 3 dark monsters on the field. So say if you have Gren Maju, but you're not able to utilize any of the banishments, so like you couldn't banish anything, or its effects got negated, you could use it to sacrifice to summon this guy instead. So gain attack equal to the total original attack of all monsters on the field with the predator counter. You can only use each of the following effects of Predaplant once per turn. I'm just gonna call it Predaplant because that's what it is. When your opponent special summons a monster from the extra deck while you control this fusion summon card. Quick effect, you can negate the summon, and if you do, destroy that monster. And if your opponent controls a monster with a Predaplant counter, you can special summon this card from your graveyard in defense position. So assuming from this card or another card you use, which was the other fusion card, this Predaplant, you can use the counters on it to summon this card from your graveyard. A really good card if you're trying to deal with some pesky summons or some pesky monsters. Like I said, I personally just don't ever get a chance to use this card. Doesn't mean you won't get a chance to use this card. Definitely would recommend using this card in a Gren Maju deck, or if you just want to throw it away with your other cards in conjunction, by all means go for it. Lastly, from your extra deck, this is the last card I'd recommend you use. It is called Topologic Zeroboros. Now this card works very similar to Gren Maju. You cannot know where someone to set this card though. You have to use 2 effect monsters. So like say if you got early game Gren Maju and you don't think you're gonna be able to use him that well, I would definitely recommend attributing him to summon this guy because he works very similar to Gren Maju, just not as strong. Because for your extra zone, this card points to it gains 200 attack for each banished card, so just like Gren Maju, but it's not as strong. But it also will gain some additional effects based on the monster zone it points to. And if another monster in special summon to a zone a link monster points to while this monster is on the field, banish all cards on the field once per turn during the standby phase of the next turn after this card was banished. By its own effect, special summon this banished card. So this card is a great way to banish additional cards on the field, or pesky cards that have been controlling the duel, and to help you turn the tables. This is actually a newer card I've actually recommended, but it's really, really powerful. It works exactly the same as Gren Maju, but with the additional effects of also banishing monsters and other additional cards on the field. Highly recommend running at least one of these, but personally I'd run 2 or 3 because if you might banish them anyway, you have a chance to use more than just one anyways. So that's going to do it for this build, everybody. Hope you guys liked the build. If there's any cards you would recommend me use for this build, be sure to let me know. I'm always looking for new ways to run Gren Maju into any of my decks. There's tons of different ways to run Gren Maju, but these are the basic cards, fundamental cards I'd recommend you run for any Gren Maju deck. So be sure to check out these cards in action and try them out for yourself and see what works best for you, because any Gren Maju deck you make could be completely different, could have these cards cards, could have completely different cards, could have all sorts of amazing cards. There are so many cards out there in the world of Yu-Gi-Oh that work well in this deck, but any card that has some kind of banishment effect, I would definitely recommend trying it with Gren Maju. Another good deck I've been playing with recently is the Thunder Dragon deck, and the Thunder Dragon deck utilizes banishes just as well as Gren Maju, so combining those two decks would be definitely something I'd recommend. Try it out for yourself, see what you like, and see what other cards you'd want to add to your versions of Gren Maju, and let me know what you guys think of this and any additional cards you'd want to add to your Gren Maju deck. So that's going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you liked the video, be sure to smash that like button down below, drop a like, leave a comment, and support your boy Nos today. And with that being said, your boy is out, and I'll see all you guys in the next video.
Damn it, I could have... Oh, all right, that's fine.
I better get a fat card. You're probably still gonna win. It all comes down to this card then. Heart of the cards!
No!
Yeah!
Oh, good lord, stop taking the fucking center.
Heart of the cards! Woohoo!
Oh!
Heart of, that was awesome!